morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a few moments. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll begin in just a few moments. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Developing a Communication Strategy, one of the ASAP webinar series. And we're very thankful for USAID and PEPFAR for allowing us to put these on. We try and do them almost every week, and we'll have a number of French webinars coming up quite soon. So stay tuned to your email newsletter that we'll send out soon. A couple of notifications for today. Wanted to again thank everybody for coming. We have had so many wonderful participants over the last, I think we're at about 48 webinars. So we really appreciate you attending. As usual, let's go ahead and use the Q&A box. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to go ahead and ask them in there. And Molly, who's our presenter today, is going to be answering them. We're going to answer most of our questions at the end of the webinar, so just hold tight until then. And in today's webinar, we may also have an opportunity for you to raise your hand and ask some questions at the end of the webinar. So we'll let you know at that time. We have two polls today. So the first one's going to be launched in a couple of minutes when I introduce Molly, and it's going to check in with you about your familiarity with communication strategies. And the last poll will be about 15 minutes before we finish the webinar, and it's just for you to give us your overall opinion about the topic and if we should be doing more with a similar topic. Don't forget that we have the webinar uploaded to our website. We'll have it on there by tomorrow, and it'll be the full recording, so you can go ahead and rewatch it and send it to friends. And then we'll also have the presentation slides available on there as well. And there's quite a number of webinars on there. So as I mentioned, we have had about 48 webinars to date with well over 9,000 attendees. And we keep them all on the website, and they're available in 3 languages. We do most of our webinars initially in English, and then we translate them to French and some of them into Portuguese. So you can go ahead actually and choose the language, and it'll filter so that you can find the webinar in those languages. And as I mentioned, we have the PDF of the slides, and the webinar recording is right on the website. So I'll go ahead and put that website in the address and or in the chat box in just a few moments. So we wanted to start this new part to our webinar series, and we really want to hear from you the ideas that you have for future topics. We sometimes get emails after the webinars, people chat with us in the chat box, and really our best topics come from all of you because you're out there implementing these projects, and we're here to serve you. So we would love to hear what topics you'd like to see coming up. Go ahead and add them to the chat box. You can add them now and throughout the entire webinar. And I'm going to make a list of all those things, and we'll try and get them to you over the next couple of months. Perfect. So today I want to introduce Molly Derrick. She is joining us from PACT, and she's the Director of Integrated Communications there at PACT. She has more than 12 years of experience in communications and advocacy with nonprofit organizations, including designing and implementing communication strategies that support project and organizational goals. And I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll now. So this first poll is about how familiar you are with communication strategies and whether or not you've worked on them in the past. So we'll keep it up for about a minute and go ahead and fill it out, and we can talk about it throughout the webinar. Here we go. All right, and I will pass the mic over to you, Molly.
Wonderful, thank you. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining today's ASAP webinar on developing a communication strategy. And thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction. As Susan said, my name is Molly Derrick, and I'm the Director of Integrated Communications at PACT. I'm excited to be with you all virtually today, and I look forward to getting to your questions later in the session. Susan, if you could move to the agenda, please. Thank you. In today's webinar, we'll cover three main sections. The first is an overview of communication strategy, including why it is important for your organization and the main components of a strategy. Next, we'll talk about how to build a strategy, from who to include in the process to what you need to know to be successful in developing your strategy. We'll then turn to putting your strategy into action, how to know what you're doing is working, and staying on top of changes inside and outside of your organization that impact your strategy. After the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please write down your questions as we go, type them in the Q&A box, or we'll also have an opportunity, as Susan said, for you to raise your hand and ask questions later in the presentation. Next slide. We likely all have many things that we want different groups of people to know about our organizations, the work we do, and more. You may have heard people say, my website says we do this, so everyone should know about it. While that is a lovely thought, most of us know that that is not the case. It reminds me of this philosophical question. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Consider this: if your organization offers a great service, but the people you want to use the service don't know about it, or know how to access it, or even where to find more information about it, then the service likely isn't going to have the impact that you would hope. Like the tree, there may be doubt that the service and its impact if somebody hasn't seen or experienced it for themselves. A communication strategy could help with this challenge. It can help you reach your organizational goals by being proactive in your planning and outreach. It can ensure you have effective, consistent messaging being delivered by the best spokespeople. It can set you up for success so that you can focus on delivering excellent communications and messages that resonate with your audiences. It can ensure that everyone at your organization is on the same page, delivering the same information and messages to the right audiences. It can also help you prioritize your efforts, especially when new opportunities come up that may or may not fit within your goals and objectives. Let's move to the next slide. There are 5 basic components of a communication strategy. We'll go over each of these in more depth in the coming slides, but I'll give you a preview of each of these now. The first is audiences. Target audiences can vary depending on what you're trying to communicate, and they can shift over time. But in general, who are you trying to communicate with? Who needs to know about your organization and what you're doing? The next is messages. What do you want to be known for? What do you need people to know about you or communicate to people? The third is channels. These are the methods for how you'll reach your target audiences with the messages they need to hear. They can vary depending on the audience and message, and will likely also change over time. 10 years ago, many of us likely didn't imagine using Facebook or another social media platform to communicate directly with our audiences, but that's where we find ourselves today. The next is frequency. How often do you need to or should you communicate with your target audiences to ensure they absorb your messages? And the last is measurement, a critical component of any strategy, including a communication strategy, is how you will know if it's working. What do you need to measure to understand if it is working? Let's dive into each of these in more detail in the next section on building a communication strategy. So before you begin building your strategy, should consider the overall goals of your organization. One of the benefits of a communication strategy is that it can help you reach your organizational goals. So being clear about what your organization is trying to accomplish is important for building a communication strategy that will help you achieve those overall goals. As you are trying to change policy at the local or national level, if that's what you're trying to do, you'll want to build a communication strategy with messages that increase your audience's awareness of the key issues and move them to act in support of policy change. And you'll want to build in measures of success, like the number of people who signed a petition, the number of government officials who supported the policy, or whether policy changes were actually made because of your communications efforts. To be successful, your communication strategy should always be tied to the goals and objectives of your organization. What do you need to say? How, where, and to whom to achieve your goals? It's also important to consider who should be a part of the strategy development process. While communication staff are central to the development of a communication strategy and are often the main staff included in the process, there are many other people to consider, including the executive director or CEO of your organization, legal or compliance staff, and technical experts or subject matter experts. Each of these organizational stakeholders have unique perspectives and contributions to bring to the development of a communication strategy. So let's dig into audiences. Your audiences are central to your communication strategy. They are important when determining what messages to deliver and how to deliver those messages to them. We'll talk about audiences in almost every aspect of developing a communication strategy. An important first step in developing your strategy is mapping your audiences. Who do you need to communicate with? There will likely be several different audiences that you need to engage. These can include community members, donors, local government, partners, staff, and many more. Even within an audience, such as community members, there's a lot of further segmentation that can be done. Characteristics like age and gender can impact things like the channels that you use to deliver your message. When mapping your audiences, be sure to get as specific as you need to develop and deliver effective messages. Once you've mapped your audiences, consider whether there are specific actions that you want or need your audiences to take. For example, you might want a community member to participate in a project activity, or a government official to be informed about your work and how it supports a government priority. Understanding what action you want each group to take or your objective with each group will help when you begin to develop your messages. A final important consideration is whether you have the right people to deliver your messages to your audiences. Trust and credibility are highly important parts of effective communications. You may be speaking to the right audience and you may have the right message, but if you don't have a level of trust with your audience or your messenger isn't seen as credible, then your messages may not be effective. So consider whether there are people within your organization who fit this description. You may even have a partner or a local community leader who would be good messengers for you. Speaking of messages, why don't we move to messages? Now that you've mapped your audiences, you know what action you want them to take, and you've figured out who in your organization or in your network could be effective messengers, it's time to look at what you need to communicate. What are those specific messages that you believe will move your audiences to act in the way that you want, from being more informed about a particular topic to possibly visiting a health facility for care? Here's where being clear about your organization's goals and purpose is really important. You typically start with a main message that cuts across your audiences. It's traditionally your why you exist as an organization, what you're trying to achieve, that overall purpose of your organization. From there, you may have specific messages for different audiences. It's often helpful to create what we call a messaging triangle or a messaging tree to organize your messages by audience. The structure basically moves from the highest level summary of your message to the most specific pieces of information and evidence that your audience will consider. The most important thing is to be clear and concise in your messages. There's a saying that if you are explaining, you're losing. If it is not apparent to your audience what your message means, it will not be effective and likely not result in anyone taking the action that you'd hoped for. In addition to being clear and concise, consider the number of messages for each audience. In general, it is harder for people to remember more than 3 main points at a time. Be clear in your ask of people to do something, help them understand why, and explain how it benefits them. Let's move to channels now. Now that you know who you're talking to and you've developed clear and concise messages that will inspire them to act in a way that you want them to, you have to think about how you'll deliver these messages or which channels you'll use. As with developing your message, you have to think about your audiences when deciding which channels to use in your communications. If your audience prefers radio to TV, then you wouldn't prioritize TV in your strategy. Do your audience members have emails that they regularly check? Or do they mostly communicate through Facebook or another social media platform? These are important to consider and to know so that you don't pick channels that are inaccessible to your audiences. Any good communication strategy should utilize multiple channels to deliver consistent messaging. This ensures your message wider reach and that audiences are more likely to retain your message if they see it across multiple channels. You should also consider what's already available to you. Many organizations have what are known as owned channels at their disposal. Things like your website, a newsletter, publications, your intranet are all owned channels that you can use to reach your audiences. Then there are earned channels. Earned channels are those that cover your organization and work because it's important to their audiences, which hopefully overlap with yours as well. These can be local print, TV, and radio, as well as other media outlets. Media coverage is one of the most effective, inexpensive, and credible ways for nonprofit organizations to generate awareness about their organization in a very crowded marketplace. While media engagement can provide benefits to your organization, it also comes with risks. Make sure that you recognize the benefits and risks of media engagement and consider how you'll balance these factors. If you haven't done a lot of media engagement before, start small by building relationships with 1 or 2 key journalists in your area who cover topics that are related to your work. Learn more about them, what they're working on, and then offer your organization as a resource. It's a great way to build a relationship with a journalist. Social is another popular channel that refers to social media like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and many more. They can either be your own organization's social media accounts or those of others. There are many social media platforms out there today, and more are likely in development as we speak. Many people believe social media is an easy channel to use, and many of the platforms are certainly easy to use. But to utilize social media in an effective way for your organization, you need to dedicate time and resources to it. You should think about each social media platform, its purpose, and whether it could serve your goals. For example, LinkedIn could be a great option for engaging with your staff, while Facebook may be better for reaching your program participants. If you have great visuals and imagery, you might want to consider Instagram, the photo sharing platform. The most important thing to remember is, where are your audiences? Finally, if you don't have any social media profiles right now and you're considering starting, start small with one platform just to get a sense of the time and effort it takes to manage it well. You'll want to be active and responsive to your audiences, no matter how many platforms you're on, which is one reason why I suggest to start small. Finally, there are paid channels. These include ads on social media, sponsored articles, and other promotional placements that you pay for. While some paid channels, like sponsored articles, can be quite costly, others, like social media ads, can be more cost effective, and they can be effective tools in your overall strategy. And speaking of paid channels, also important in determining your channels are the resources that you have available, both financial and human. Running TV ads or programs may take more financial resources than you're able to dedicate to them at this point. Maintaining multiple social media platforms takes a lot of time and dedicated effort to do really well, and you may not have the staff to run multiple accounts at this point. It's important to be realistic in planning to set yourself up for success in implementation. Next, let's talk about frequency. An important but often overlooked aspect of communications planning is the frequency or the cadence of communications that you have with your audiences. Having clear, concise messages is important, but adding consistent communications will further help your audience retain your messages. The frequency may not be the same for all of your audiences. You might need to communicate more frequently with certain groups, like your staff, and less frequent with others. And sometimes the frequency might be set for you, like with regular reporting to your donor or set partner meetings. Other times, you'll need to consider how often an audience might need or want to hear from you. As with everything we've talked about so far, consider your audience and their needs, and don't be scared to ask them. Sometimes it's easiest to ask, how often do you want to hear from us? Let's move to measurement. What you measure should help you evaluate whether your strategy is effective and whether it needs to be adjusted. There are many different types of metrics you can select to measure your communication strategy. You can measure your activities. These are often output measures, such as sending one newsletter per month or holding 2 events per quarter. You can also measure the reach of your communications. How many people opened your newsletter, or how many people visited your website last month? Moving further along the customer funnel beyond reach, you can measure engagement. For social media, this could be the number of likes, comments, retweets, and shares your social media posts receive. For your website, it could be the number of downloads of a publication from your sites or the people who signed up for a newsletter. You can also measure impact. Did your communications influence a policy change? Did an audience change a particular behavior because of your communications? While there are many different metrics that you can select, the most important thing to remember is to build in metrics based on what you're trying to achieve with your communication strategy. And make sure that you have metrics for each of your channels so that you know if they're working. As we move to the next section on implementing your strategy, your metrics will be critical for understanding how your strategy is working and whether you need to adjust or improve upon it. So let's talk about implementing your communication strategy. Next slide, please. Now that you've done all the work to build your communication strategy, it's time to put your strategy to use. Timelines are essential for helping you stay on track when transitioning from the planning phase to implementation. Think about how often you want to review your plan. Regularly reviewing your metrics on a monthly or quarterly basis can help you stay on track. Other good times to review your performance include after a major event, social media campaign, or other discrete activities. You should also regularly review your audiences. Have they changed? Have the dynamics within a specific audience changed over time? As we continue to experience changes in our world and access to information, you should also evaluate whether there are new channels at your disposal or whether your audiences are utilizing different channels today than they were when you began. Innovation is happening all around us, and new platforms and tools are constantly being developed. Perhaps there's a new social media platform available or a new type of video experience that you want to explore, like 360 VR. You don't always have to be on the latest social media platform or utilizing the newest technology. Make sure that the channel is relevant to your audiences. It is important to stay up to date with the methods of communication and how they may or may not support your goals and fit your audience needs and preferences. But don't feel compelled to act on the latest idea or product unless it works for you. You may also find new tools and processes to communicate more efficiently and effectively as you implement your strategy. Being able to adapt and improve on your strategy will help you be a more successful communicator and achieve your organization's objectives. Next slide, please. Before we move into the final section, I'd like to talk a little bit about crisis communications for a minute. Being prepared for a potential crisis has always been important in communications planning, but this past year has really brought crisis communications into the forefront of every communicator's mind, and likely many people who are not communicators. A crisis can be many different things. It can be a global pandemic that impacts the health and safety of your staff and the people your organization serves. We all know that very well. It can also be a negative story that appears in a local paper, or it could be an ethical issue that arises within your organization or in one of your projects. Not all issues or crises need external action. A negative tweet about your organization from an account that only has 10 followers likely will not warrant a response. An opinion piece in the largest local newspaper that uses incorrect facts about your organization or your work may warrant a direct response. It's important to be prepared for these potential crises, to know who within your organization should be alerted to the issue. Communications and legal staff are commonly involved, as well as the executive director or CEO. If it's a financial issue, You'll want to include your finance director or CFO. With a programmatic issue, you'd likely include your head of programs or the project director. Bringing the right people together to quickly assess the issue and determine the best course of action is critical. And sometimes it may require no action. In addition to thinking internally, you should also consider who needs to be notified outside of your organization. Does it impact your partners? What about your donor? What about the people your organization serves? Again, this all depends on the issue at hand. What is the potential crisis? In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone has been impacted. Our lives and work have been upended. This is where having multiple channels to reach your audiences can be extremely beneficial. You may not have been able to utilize in-person channels like events and meetings. Many of us began relying exclusively on digital channels. Email, SMS, phone calls, they all increased. When you're thinking about your channels and your communications planning, keep in mind disruptions to one or more of your channels and whether you have other means of reaching your audiences in the unexpected absence of one of your regular channels. Next slide, please. Actually, you can go ahead and skip to the key components. Thanks. A thoughtful communication strategy that is aligned with your organization's goals will help you to meet your objectives. Keeping your audiences in mind throughout the process, from developing messages that resonate with them to selecting channels that are accessible to them. Your audiences are central to your communication strategy. Map them and determine what actions you want each audience to take. Keep your messages clear and concise, and don't overwhelm your audiences with too many messages. Most people can only retain 3 key messages at a time. Think about what channels are available to you and where your audiences already exist. Utilize multiple channels to deliver consistent messaging that reaches people in multiple ways. Plan a steady flow of communications for your audiences. You may not need to communicate with each of your audiences at the same time or with the same frequency. Think about how often they need to hear from you and how often you need to communicate with them. Finally, build metrics into your strategy based on what you are trying to achieve. Have metrics for each of your channels, and don't forget to review them regularly. Being proactive in your communications planning can make all the difference in being successful. It can sometimes be overwhelming to get started, but by focusing on the key components above, you can set yourself and your organization up for success. Next slide, please. Thank you for joining this conversation today and for your attention throughout the presentation. We'll be happy to take questions now. If you have a question you'd like to ask and haven't shared it yet, please remember to type it into the Q&A box on your screen, or you can raise your hand. I also wanted to mention that I have an example communications plan that I'd be happy to pull up so that you could see different components of a communication strategy and format. It's something that we get asked about a lot. We know the components that are supposed to go into a communication strategy, but what should it look like? And there's no set answer for that. It can take many different forms. It depends on what works for you and your organization, but I'd be happy to show one if you would be interested in that. So, looks like we have some questions. Okay.
Sorry, Molly, I was having a hard time getting myself off of mute there. Yeah, so we have quite a number of questions. Right now we're going to use the Q&A box for our questions, and then later on we may also do some audio questions. So we'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. So I'll start going through some of the questions. The first question, what do you advise about communication to our donors besides regular reports and work emails? That's a great question. There are many different types of communication that you can have with your donors that go beyond the reports that you regularly have to send to them. It can be engaging with your donors on social media. I'm sure you have regular meetings with them and you frequently engage with them, probably on a daily basis through emails. But beyond the day-to-day operational aspects of your engagement with them, you could consider engaging with them on social media, sharing stories, tagging your donors in content that you're putting out, sharing publications that come out that perhaps are outside of your regular donor reporting. Those are just a few things that you could do. You could also consider hosting events with your donor. If you have, for example, if your project or your organization is focused on a particular issue that is really important to your donor, you could consider hosting a chat with them that's open to stakeholders within your industry. Someone asked to say a little bit more on earned media. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about earned media. So as I said in the presentation, earned media is a really great tool. Similar to what I shared about social media, earned media takes a dedicated time and effort. It's a lot of relationship building. It's evaluating what outlets are most important to you. A lot of people take the approach that you send out a press release or you send out a pitch to a wide variety of potential journalists, say 50 in one pitch. And you might have something that results from that. But if you are just starting out, trying to develop a relationship with a journalist that you've noticed covers a lot of the issues that you are working on or that your organization has a particular interest in can be a good way to get started. Reaching out to them, introducing yourself, talking about your organization, but noting that you notice that this is a priority of theirs, and you have technical experts, subject matter experts, who would be happy to talk more with them about a particular topic that interests them. Or if they're ever looking for a source or somebody who can provide a unique perspective on the topic, to please consider your organization a resource. It's a lot of relationship management with earned media. You can have a very proactive approach to earned media. If you are working on a topic that is of significant interest, not just to local media, but to national and international media, you may have media coming to you all the time, and you may be more reactive to that. And that's fine. That is a good way to start getting your feet wet with engaging with earned media. Okay. Let's see. Someone asked if I could give an example of an owned channel. I'm happy to. So, your website is typically your most recognizable owned channel. So, if you have a website, or maybe you have a blog via WordPress, that would be an owned channel. So, it's something that your organization has control over and runs. If you don't have a website, or you don't have a blog, a presence online like that, you may have a newsletter that you send out. It could be an electronic newsletter or a print newsletter, but it's basically something that you have control over, the messages that go out in that channel. Okay, let's see. Is it necessary to involve the target audience while developing a communication strategy? That's a really great question. It is necessary to understand your target audience. You don't necessarily have to include them in the development of the actual communication strategy, but you do need to have information on where they are in terms of what is accessible to them via channels. You need to have an understanding of what the needs of your audiences are. Do you understand what your donor is looking for from you? Do you understand what the issues are for the people that you serve in your programs? You need to have some level of understanding of that to build an effective communication strategy. So you can approach that in different ways. You can have direct conversations with your donor ahead of building a communication strategy if you aren't clear on what they're looking for. You can do a survey of an audience to find out more before you build your communication strategy. You can also just do a little market research ahead of time. So there are different ways to gather that information beyond having them actually involved in the development of the communication strategy. How different is an annual communications plan from a communication strategy? That's a really great question, and is something that I think people use communications plan and communication strategy interchangeably. So a communication strategy might be different from a branding and marketing plan that you may be familiar with, but a communications plan and a communication strategy are really the same documents. Most people use those terms interchangeably. You may also hear communication strategy planning. Sometimes people combine the words. After developing the communication strategy, how do I get everybody in the organization on board and be part of the overall execution? Again, a really great question. Um, so, as I said, in developing the plan, it's important to involve people across your organization in the development of the plan. There may be particular people like your CEO or executive director, your subject matter experts, legal and compliance staff that have some kind of stake. Everyone has a stake in successful communications planning, but they may have a particular point of view that would be helpful to include in the planning. But once you have the plan, you kind of have to communicate it internally and to market your communication strategy internally in order for everyone to be on the same page about who are your audiences, what are the messages that need to be delivered. They need to have visibility into the plan. and buy-in. So I'd recommend sharing it with all of your staff. And you could consider doing something like a brown bag to answer questions, to talk more about the strategy, the components of the strategy, how you arrived at your target audiences, and really have people buy in to the information that's in your strategy, and then use it. And it's an ongoing challenge. You have to constantly, as you might change your strategy, as your program might change, as you go through that refresh and review, it's important to also touch base with your staff on that. I think this also brings up a really important point around internal communications. A lot of people think about communicating externally when they think about a communication strategy. But internal communications is also really important. And so you may remember in the presentation, I mentioned staff a couple of times as a key audience, or LinkedIn being a way to reach your staff. It's really important that your staff understand your organization and your purpose and what you're trying to accomplish, and that they feel connected to it and bought into your efforts. So internal communications is really important, and communicating your communications plan to your staff would be a part of internal communications. Um, there was a comment that medical organizations are not really allowed to advertise. So advertising is a tool. It's not a tool that is available to everyone. So there are sometimes restrictions around different channels that you can use, whether you can use certain types of funding for advertising. Those are things that you have to take into consideration when you are assessing the different channels that are available to you. Okay. A little bit similar to a previous question around involving your target audiences in your communication strategy development. There's a question around, when do you bring those target audiences in to participate in the process? Do you have a bottom-up approach to developing a communication strategy? So again, I think that really depends on the level of information that you have about your strategy, or excuse me, about your audiences. Do you know enough about your audiences to factor that into your communications planning? If you don't, you may have to go to your audiences for that necessary information before you start building a communication strategy. Another option is, once you have a communication strategy, you can also test different components of it with your audiences. I mean, as much as you prepare and you have the necessary information, you may have the necessary information to build a strong communications plan. Part of this is also the implementation, the execution of your communication strategy. Part of it is also testing. So you may know that you have a particular audience that has a very specific need. You have developed messages around that need. You know where they exist, what channels are available to them. You are utilizing those channels, but yet maybe they aren't engaging, or maybe they aren't, they don't feel like the message is resonating with them. It's one of the reasons why you should constantly evaluate your communications, to learn from them, to adjust. And if you are seeing that in your implementation, you can go to your audiences and have that conversation with them through focus group discussions, surveys, and other options for gathering that type of feedback.
So Molly, we've had a number of requests for people to see the communication strategy example.
I can
And we are
definitely
just
do
getting so many good questions. This is amazing. Thank you everybody for your questions. They're, very insightful, and it's really going to allow us to help each other out. Every question you have, somebody else is thinking of it. So go ahead and ask your questions in the Q&A.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen really quickly and show you a communications plan that that was developed. Again, you'll see that communications plans are very different depending on, they don't all have to look the same. So this is a communications plan for a coalition that I was a part of. It's a Word doc. It's nothing fancy. I think this is one of the things that a lot of people ask. What format should it take? What should it look like? And the answer is it can be very different depending on what you need, what works for you. So I could probably show you 10 different communications plans, and they would all look different. They would all have very similar components in them, but they would be structured very differently. So this is this is a communications plan for a coalition that, again, I was a part of, my organization was a part of. So we started out with who we are as a coalition, explaining our objective as a coalition, and then going into sub objectives. We tied metrics to each one of our sub objectives. Again, it's really important to have metrics that you would be able to measure whether you are achieving your objectives. Because we also it's a little bit of a different terminology. We talked about an identity, and that's more of a brand identity. So this is a little bit includes a little bit of what you would find in a branding plan as well, and not just a communications plan. So it's a little bit of a mix. But what did we want? What did we want to project to our audiences? What did we want them to know or to feel about us? We then went into our audiences and really broke down. We had 3 different audiences, but then we had some subcategories for each of our audiences. From there, we looked at our core narrative. So what are the main messages about the coalition that we want to share? And we broke those down by audience. So our first audience, what are the main messages that we want to impart to them? Hopefully you will see that there are 3 here, there are 3 here, and only 2 here. So again, we really, even though they're slightly longer, more in a paragraph form, you will notice those 3s as you're moving through and looking at this. So then we talked about methods, messengers, and media. So this is getting to channels, and this might be where you see some differences in terminology. Some people refer to them as channels, others refer to them as methods. Some people refer to them as tactics. They vary. So we talked about the different methods that we would use and provided overviews of those methods, and how we would utilize them as a coalition, including events and in-person and virtual events, the online convenings, publications, so actual communications products. So this is just a sample of what what one communications plan looks like. And if you notice, it covers all of the elements that we talked about in the presentation, but they're not necessarily in that exact laid out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 order. Again, because it can be different based on what works for your organization. Does anybody have any questions about the communications, the format of a communications plan? And again, a great question before: communication strategy versus communications plan. You'll see here it's called a communications plan. See, I'm going to go back to the Q&A. Maybe I'll take a, it looks like there might be a couple other questions coming in, but I'll take a couple of questions in the meantime. There was a question around security and utilizing how you can control the security of your organization when you're using social media and what precautions you should take. So it's a great question, and something that that a lot of people are talking about today, particularly with the hacks that are happening, not just for organizations, emails and sites and servers, but also public and private organizations, private companies, and that I know many people who have had their social media profiles hacked. Thankfully, that has not happened to Pact, but I think ensuring that you have good, strong passwords. You are enabling two-factor authentication when that is possible, when that is available to you, can help secure your accounts. But in terms of other than like the security of your accounts, you might also be thinking about how putting your organization out there on social media, utilizing social media, increases the visibility of your organization. It increases the chance that there could be risks associated with that. So if that is also part of your security question, it's also a very valid one, and it's something that, for example, Pact developed a social media handbook for our staff. And some of the things that we talked about in the social media handbook are, what should you be doing? How should you be engaging on social media? What information should you not be sharing? And a lot of times location data is something that we don't share because we don't want to be so specific that we open ourselves up to unnecessary security risks. So that's one way that we've done that with social media. I hope that helps. But if you have any other questions about security, or if that wasn't exactly what you were thinking, please feel free to put a follow-up in the chat.
Perfect. Molly, we're getting a bunch of questions about how to measure, what type of indicators should you be using, both with social media and the communication strategy as a whole.
Yeah, so I'll start with social media. I think a lot of people immediately think of how many followers do I have on my social media platform. And if you have recently started a social media platform, if you have recently started your own organizational account, that's a great first step. It's how many people know about you and are following you. But the next step from there is to measure engagement. So you can look at your overall engagement rate for your social media accounts, but you can also look at individual posts. And we do a little bit of both. We look at overall engagement rate for, say, our Twitter account for a month. But then we also break it down and say, well, we have these different types of posts. We post videos, we post static images, we do polls on Twitter. What type of engagement do we get on the different types of posts to see what maybe works better than others? What types of posts work better than others? What gets more engagement? Is it all likes? Is it also, are people commenting a lot on it? So I think it depends on what you're hoping to achieve. But starting with something that's a little bit more focused on reach, if you're early in the process, and building to measuring engagement, and that can be likes, comments, shares. Those are more are more popular types of measures for social media. For your overall communications plan, there isn't one metric or one measure for your communications plan typically overall. So in order to understand if your communications plan is working, you really have to look back at those goals and objectives and then take the measures that you have built. So I used an example of policy change. If your organization is focused on changing policy at the national level, and you have built out messages, and you have targets around government officials who have changed their position on a particular policy issue, and you have been targeting that, they were one of your key audiences, and you have been targeting them with dedicated communications through your strategy, and you are seeing those government officials change the way they vote, or they are making public statements in support of the issue. Those are the types of things that you would be using as proof points and measures for your communication strategy. But there are lots of different types of metrics. It really does depend on what your overall goal is as to which you pick. You might also have, for example, maybe you want to be a thought leader in a particular space on a particular topic that is of importance to you. So you may have metrics like that are based on your outputs. So you have published X number of publications. You may have media targets. So you have pitched X number of articles that resulted in, Y number of media mentions. You may be looking for a certain percentage of engagement on your social media. So you may be targeting a specific engagement rate. And all of these things are really about visibility of your organization. And you're looking at those types of metrics if you want to be a thought leader. Beyond the visibility, are people then citing your publications? So if you want to be a thought leader in a particular area, it's not enough to just put out these different outputs, but are people then utilizing those and saying, okay, this organization knows what they're talking about, and I'm going to cite them in my in my media article, or I'm going to link to them on my website because they have this really fantastic resource. So you can look at things like backlinks to your website, and citations of your materials in thinking about in evaluating whether you are successful in becoming a thought leader. As much as we all say we want to be thought leaders, not everybody can be a thought leader, and it really takes those measures to understand if your strategy is working. So those are just some examples for two different types of goals that you may have.
So we have actually a really great question. I think actually a lot of the questions relate to this. People are wondering, what is the best way to develop the communication strategy when you have a lot of different projects that your organization is running? How do those different projects and the communication strategy for those projects fit into the overall organization strategy?
That's a really, really great question, and actually something that we deal with a lot at PACT. We have a lot of different types of projects, but as an organization, there's a unifying theme that really runs across all of these projects and why we do them. And I would assume that that is likely the case for your organization as well. So you may have projects that are focused on healthcare. You may also have governance projects. You may have projects that are addressing climate change, and they may all be within the same organization. And so it's hard to at first glance it might be hard to figure out how all of those fit together, and you may want to create different communications plans for different ones. But it's really important to understand and to be able to communicate to your audiences how all of this fits together. And that's where being really clear about your organization's purpose, mission, and goals, and then making sure that when you build your communication strategy, you keep those at the top. You keep those front and center, and you say, okay, well, if this is the organizational mission and goals, this is why we exist. How do all of these different projects fit into this? And develop messages that resonate across those projects. That's not saying that you will not have specific communications plans for individual projects, because there will be times where you have to go down to a more micro level to a project to develop a communications plan, because it has particular different and unique needs. But there will typically be this unifying theme that runs across all of your work as an organization, and being able to pull that out into messages and that are clear and concise, that then your various projects can see themselves in. So this is also one reason why it's really important to involve different stakeholders across your organization in the development of your communications plan. So for example, at PACT, actually right now we're doing a survey and some focus group discussions with our staff on messaging and how our current messages resonate with the different types of projects that we have at the organization. And we will be feeding that into our communications strategy for the coming year. There's There's a question in here about the frequency of communications if you're using social media, and how frequent does it have to be? And do you need to repeat the contents that you're sharing? So that's a really great question, and I kind of wish I didn't always start the answer with "it depends," but it depends on the platform. So there are certain platforms that move faster than others. Twitter is one of the faster moving platforms. So there are a lot of people sending tweets every day, that it's really easy for your tweets to get lost in that volume of content that's being shared if you are only tweeting once a day. So I would recommend for the platforms where there's just a greater volume to tweet more often. We try to tweet multiple times a day. Sometimes we're sharing original tweets. Sometimes, if it's particularly if you're starting out and coming up with original tweets feels like a challenge, you can also retweet partners or thought leaders in your space, your donors or your government partners. So you can look at your network of people on a social media platform and share their content as well, if it is relevant to you. So it doesn't always have to be your original content. For Facebook, it's a little bit different. We typically post a little bit less often on Facebook, but if your audience is primarily on Facebook, and that's your for example, if your community members that you serve are primarily on Facebook, and that is a main channel to communicate with them, you would likely be communicating with them more frequently via Facebook. And it doesn't have to be in a public Facebook page for your organization. You could create a Facebook group to communicate directly with an audience. So it's a closed group of just you and some of your audience members, where you're having more of a dialogue with them. So that could be another option. Again, just to reiterate, it really depends on the platform and the volume of the information and content that you are basically competing against to be seen. Let's see. I believe I already touched on this one, but just to reiterate, there's a question about how to get feedback from target audiences for the communication strategy. There are a number of different ways you can accomplish that. You can either you can hold focus group discussions with your target audience. You can do a survey of your target audience. You can have individual conversations with leaders within an audience, a group. So there are a number of different ways you can accomplish that. You can also do things like feedback with, for example, at the end of this webinar, there's going to be a survey, a poll on the webinar. You can integrate things like that into the implementation of your communication strategy, so that you can constantly be getting this feedback and information that you can take into consideration when you are evaluating whether your communication strategy is working. Another point that I'd like to make, that some folks might be wondering, is the length of your communication strategy. So a lot of people, not the physical length of the document, but how long you should be planning for. So that is something that again, you typically plan for a longer period of time. You may not develop a communications plan for the full 5 years of a project or even 3 years of a project, because a lot of things change over the course of your project, and there may be different phases of your work, and you would want to adjust your strategy over that time. Um, a year is a very common time frame to plan for. What do you want to accomplish? What will you be focusing on in your first year? Then when you look at your second year, you aren't starting from scratch. You can go back and say, again, have my audiences changed? Have things shifted within? Am I looking at a new audience? Was my initial goal awareness? And that awareness is now there. So now that they are aware, I want them to act. So you might need to shift and change your priorities based on what your focus is, how successful you have been in the first year of your communication strategy, and as you progress along in your project. So that's one other thing that we often get asked is how long you should be planning for.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our final poll. And then one of the other questions that we have, which I think is a great one, especially for our industry, where we're always trying to do everything with the least amount of money, but the biggest impact possible. What are some of the best ways to implement a communication strategy when you're looking at having really low funds to make those things happen? Is it social media? What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that I know we all are faced with at different times, the resource constraints. So communications, you can do a lot with just the level of effort of a staff member. You don't have to have fancy tools and paid ads and sponsored articles. As I mentioned, media engagement while it comes with risks, it is also a great way to reach a very wide audience. One of the things that, whether it's traditional media or it's social media, one of the tips that I would share for if you are looking at a resource constrained environment is that think about who is in your network and who could be a messenger for you. And you may have a partner who has a network on social media that is 3 times the size of yours. And your audience overlaps in a lot of ways. How can you work together to host a Twitter chat, or even just asking your partner to share your messages as well? If you are partnering together, you likely have these common goals that they would probably be happy to share those. So looking also at how what you're doing can be amplified by others that are within your network could be a really great way to expand your reach and your messaging without you having to invest in additional things that are typically paid. as everyone is taking the poll, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for your really great questions. I know we probably did not get to all of them, but thank you so much for joining your morning, afternoon, or evening. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Susan for having me today, and for hosting this webinar, and to the whole ASAP team.
Thank you, Molly, for spending your time with us today and for answering so many questions. I know we still have some in the Q&A, but we have certainly answered a ton already. And I think what we've learned is that people really want more webinars on communications topics, on social media, success stories, and other ways that you can communicate your project's success. So that's really good information for us here at ASAP, and we're going to take that and make sure that we develop some more webinar topics.
Great.
Well, again, thank you everybody so much for joining us. Today's a little bit shorter of a webinar, and I think actually this is good for us to sort of test. I think we gave you a lot of information, but we made sure this time that we had a long period for questions. So if you could do me a favor, at the bottom of your screen, you have the option to raise hand. I'm going to ask a question, and feel free to raise your hand. And I just want to sort of get an overall view of how many people. Would you like to see our webinars be about an hour long in future? Go ahead and raise your hand if you think yes. All right, good to see. Excellent. I'm going to give it just another moment, and then I'll go ahead and lower your hands, and I'm going to ask one more question, if that's all right. All right, so quite a number of people. That's good to know. All right, and my next question is for the Q&A portion. Would you like us to expand how long our Q&As are in our webinars? You know, we love to present and show you guys, you know, everything we've learned in our years of experience, but your questions are so important, and I think it also helps each of us to learn from each other. And the questions that we're seeing, it's really helping me get an idea for future webinars. So go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to see a larger Q&A portion to webinars in the future. Definitely, that's what I'm seeing. Wonderful. All right. Well, we really appreciate the engagement. That's really wonderful. All right, so I'm going to leave the poll running for just another about 30 seconds. So go ahead and get your answers in there and make sure that you hit submit at the bottom there. All right, excellent. All right, thank you so much. So as always, we're going to provide a link to both the recording of the webinar and the presentation slides as a PDF. We'll upload them to the IntraHealth website, and we'll send the link so that you'll be able to view them there. And as well at the website, there are many, many other webinars that you can view on demand. So thank you all so much. And we're going to give you back a little bit of your time today. Have a great day and a great rest of your week. Bye, everybody.